The purpose of this lecture is to get to know some of the groups within the Angiosperm phylum. Specifically, the goals are that by the end of this lecture, you should be able to distinguish between basal angiosperms and between the monocots and also the eudicots. Additionally, you should be familiar with the characteristics of all of the families listed here, and you should be able to associate a species that you find in the field correctly with one of these families, if that species is in one of these families. So we're going to start by taking sort of a big picture look at the diversity within angiosperms, and then we're going to hone in and we're going to look at just these 10 families. Okay, so this is a screenshot of the phylogeny of the vascular plants that's in the new Jepson's manual. So you'll notice it includes lycophytes, the ferns, the gymnosperms, the nymphales, the magnoliids, the ceratophales, the eudicots, and the monocots. So the bryophytes are not listed in the Jepson's manual, and that's because it's a manual for the identification of vascular plants only. And this is a different way of looking at the diversity within this group. This is called a phylogeny or a phylogenetic tree. And it's showing us the relatedness between the groups. So back here, this would have been an ancestor to all vascular plants. And this phylogeny is showing us that we believe that the lycophytes branched off first. And then that's followed by the ferns. And then we know that the gymnosperms are the sister group to the angiosperms. So this phylogeny shows them sharing a more recent common ancestor down here with the angiosperms. And then it shows us that there are these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 groups of angiosperms. We're going to start by taking a look at the nymphales and the magnoliids, or these basal groups of angiosperms. Many refer to them as primitive angiosperms, and you can see that they did branch off more distantly than the rest of the angiosperms, than the really large groups, the eudicots and the monocots. So they are primitive in that sense. And then we'll also take a close look at the eudicots and the monocots and some of the large families within those two groups. Okay, so before we take a look at the basal angiosperms, I want to be sure that everyone is clear about the differences between the monocots and the eudicots. And also I want to talk a little bit about the term dicots. So your book used the term dicots almost interchangeably with eudicots. Eudicots is a better term to describe a group of angiosperms that have all of these characteristics. So eudicots are plants that the embryos, so when the embryo is in the seed, it has two cotyledons or seed leaves. So if you dissect the seed, you see two tiny leaf-like appendages already in the embryo. They also have net-like venation, so the veins branch and they look almost like a net. They have a very specific arrangement of their vascular tissue. Remember we talked about this, the vascular tissue in the stem is arranged in bundles, and those bundles form a ring in the eudicots. Eudicots generally have a main root or a taproot present, They generally have pollen grains. If you get them under the microscope, you see that those pollen grains have 3 apertures or openings or pores. And if you take a look at their flower, you generally see that the Eudicot flower has floral parts in multiples of 4 or 5. So 4 or 5 petals and sepals and stamens, and sometimes carpels. So all Eudicots have these characteristics. We used to use the term dicots to describe plants that had 2 cotyledons, but the basal angiosperms got lumped in. Some of the basal angiosperms got lumped in to that group, the dicots, and they didn't really have all of those dicot characteristics. They had some characteristics of a large group of plants called the monocots. Monocots, unlike the dicots, if you look at the embryo, you see that there's just one little seed leaf or cotyledon in the embryo. They don't have net venation. Their veins are parallel. Their vascular bundles are not arranged in a ring in the stem. They're just sort of scattered throughout the stem. Their root system doesn't have a main root or a taproot, so it's what we refer to as fibrous. Their pollen grains have only one opening, and their floral organs are usually in multiples of 3. So 3 petals, 3 sepals, or 6 petals and 6 sepals. This is a really obvious distinction between angiosperms, and this was something that was first proposed by Theophrastus in 370 BC. So we've clued in to these big differences that we see within groups of angiosperms for a long time. We've been looking into this for a long time. So now the best terms to use to distinguish between these 2 large groups of angiosperms is the monocots and the eudicots. And now I want to go back and take a look at those basal angiosperms, many of which used to be considered dicotyledons, and we don't use that term anymore. And I think you'll see why their placement was confusing for so many years. So the basal angiosperms have monocot and eudicot traits. Many of them possess traits of both monocots and eudicots. So this was really confusing for a long time to figure out, well, are these organisms dicots or are they monocots? We took them out of the dicot group, and now that's why we refer to the rest of the organisms that have 2 cotyledons as eudicots. So we believe that the basal angiosperms have characteristics of both monocots and eudicots because they evolved before those traits sort of got set in the body plan of these 2 large groups of angiosperms, the monocots and the eudicots. So basal angiosperms include plants in the group Nymphales, which is a relatively small group of plants like this water lily. So the plants in that group are floating aquatic plants. You've probably seen them before. The Nymphales, it was tricky to place them, so they were originally considered to be dicots because they have the dicot stem anatomy. However, like the monocots, they have a single aperture in the pollen. Sometimes they have floral parts in 3, and sometimes their flowers can have spiral arrangement. You can see that here on the magnolia flower. Spiral arrangement is when you don't have the distinct whorls or levels. You can kind of see how these stamens are not all in a single plane, but they're sort of creeping up the receptacle. And the same is true for these carpels. So that's called spiral arrangement. And the Nymphales, the water lilies, have a single cotyledon, but it has two lobes, so it sort of looks like a dicotyledon. So the point is that they have characteristics of both monocots and dicots. So they are considered an ancient lineage, and it was difficult to figure out which group of angiosperms they belonged to for a long time. The same is true of the magnoliids. Magnoliids have two cotyledons, but they only have one pollen aperture like monocots do. Like the dicots, or the eudicots rather, they have net venation. They have large flowers like the magnolia flower here that are spirally arranged, or some of them have flowers with floral parts in multiples of 3. So one other thing I wanted to point out about the magnolia is you can see that the stamen are pretty funky. So these are what we call leaf-like stamen. I mentioned to you previously that the flower is a modified shoot. So all of the structures of the flowers are modified leaves. And you can really get a sense of that when you look at some of these primitive or basal angiosperms. Some of their floral structures are more leaf-like. Magnoliids include plants like the beautiful flowering magnolia trees, also the trees that generate avocados and nutmeg and cinnamon and white pepper and black pepper. So many angiosperms of economic importance are in that group. Okay, so now let's move on to one of these huge groups of more recently evolved angiosperms, the monocots. There are about 60,000 species of monocots globally, and this includes plants like palms and sedges and rushes and grasses, and plants with showy flowers like orchids, which we see pictured here, and lilies, which we see pictured here. These plants are going to have all of those characteristics that I showed you in the chart for the monocotyledons, or the monocots. So they have one cotyledon, the embryo within the seed is one cotyledon. Their veins on their leaves are parallel. They have floral parts in 3s or some multiple of 3. Their pollen has one pore or aperture. And there's an irregular distinction or distribution of the vascular bundles within the stem. So within the monocot clade, I'd like you to be familiar with the orchid family, Orchidaceae. This is a large family, very species rich, with 25,000 species globally. Many orchids are tropical or subtropical, but we do have some representatives of this family in the temperate regions. They are entirely terrestrial, and they're all herbaceous plants. Their stems are often underground, as you can see here in this picture. So they often have underground stems like tubers or corms or rhizomes. And then the roots and the leaves are arising out of those stems. As you can see here, the leaves have parallel venation. Members of this family often have very intricate and showy flowers. That's one of the reasons why people like to grow orchids, because they have such unique flowers, which are bilaterally symmetric. So if we take a look at this drawing down here by Ernst Haeckel, we see that these orchids are all bilaterally symmetric. They have symmetry. They only have one plane of symmetry right through the center of the flower. Orchids often have lower lip petals. So you can see in this one, they have this petal that sort of hangs down, and in this one, and in this one. So these are, that would be considered a lip. Sometimes that lip is sort of curled up into a sac. Oftentimes, orchid flowers have spurs or projections that are sort of shooting back towards the stem. The fruit, in the case of the orchids, is a capsule that generates tiny dust-sized seeds. Now let's take a look at the lily family, Liliaceae. This is a much smaller family with only about 600 species globally. This family includes perennial herbs, so all herbaceous plants in the Liliaceae family. Like the Orchidaceae, they're monocots, so they have leaves with parallel venation. Also, like the orchids, the lilies are often coming out of the ground from an underground stem, like a bulb or a rhizome. They have a perianth. Remember, perianth is the term for the calyx and the corolla. So they have a perianth with 6 free parts. So it includes 2 petal-like whorls. So the sepals are very difficult to distinguish from the petals in lilies. They look very similar. So we refer to it as a perianth. All of the petals are free from each other, so they're not fused. All of the petals and sepals are free. The fruit in the lilies is often a capsule. Next, let's take a look at another large group of monocots, the grasses in the Poaceae family. So this family includes 10,000 species globally. These plants are of great economic importance because so many of them produce important agricultural commodities like corn and rice. Grasses are mostly herbaceous. One notable distinction would be bamboo. Their stems are round and hollow, and you can see that if you look at this section through this stem. So the grass stems are hollow, and they have nodes, and you've probably seen these nodes before in the grass stem where the stem sort of gets a little bit fatter. So that's what the node is on a grass stem. Grasses generate flowers that are generally wind pollinated, so they lack showy sepals and petals, and they're typically part of an inflorescence that would be classified as a spike. So all of these flowers are coming off together in an inflorescence that we would call a spike because they're all pretty closely oppressed to the central stalk of the inflorescence. Like the other monocots, grasses have leaves with parallel venation. They're often linear leaves. They have a structure called a ligule at the leaf base, and you can see that ligule, it's often this kind of like papery membrane that sticks up right where the leaf attaches to the stem. Grasses have fibrous root systems. Rhizomes are also common in grasses that spread, so sometimes they're coming up off of underground stems. And we call the fruit of grasses a grain. Now let's take a look at the other large group of angiosperms, the eudicots. There are around 170,000 species of eudicots. So more than half of all living plant species are eudicots. So this is a huge group. Remember, we said that these plants are united in that their embryos have 2 little seed leaves, 2 cotyledons. Their flowers are generally in parts of 4s or 5s. You can see here on this buttercup, we've got 5 large petals. And their pollen grains all have 3 apertures or pores. Okay, so I want you to be familiar with the mint family, which is a relatively large family of eudicots. There are around 7,200 species in the Lamiaceae family globally. Most of them are herbaceous. They commonly have strong scents. So this family includes plants like peppermint and chocolate mint and basil and oregano. So often when you crush the leaves or the stems of these plants, they have a really strong odor. The leaves are often coming off the stem opposite, like you can see up here in this drawing. So these leaves are coming off opposite. And the leaves and the stem and sometimes even the flowers are hairy. So lots of plants within this family have hairs. You can see that here in this picture. One really good field characteristic for identifying a plant within this family is to feel the stem. So they have square stems. So if you take a hold of the stem and try to roll it back and forth between your thumb and your forefinger, you'll notice that it is strongly four-sided. You may have noticed that when you've cut basil, that the stem is square in cross section. Most of the plants within the mint family have flowers with bilateral symmetry, and you can see that here in this flower. So they have one plane of symmetry right through the center, and they have a 2-lipped corolla. So here we can see the 5 petals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, are fused. And we see that, but we can tell there were 5 petals because we can sort of see these lobes. But they're fused in a way where we can see we've got one lower lip and one upper lip. The lower lip being made of 3 petals that have fused, and the upper lip being made of 2 petals that have fused. The flowers can be terminal, so they can be up at the tip of the stem, or they can be coming out of the leaf axils, which is what we see here. So here's a cluster of flowers coming out of the leaf axials in this particular plant. The fruit that's generated by species within the mint family are little nuts or nutlets. Another large group of eudicots are the plants within the family Asteraceae. So this is a large group containing 23,000 species globally, including well-known plants like sunflowers and daisies. These plants range in terms of their habits. Some of them are annual herbaceous plants, perennial herbaceous plants, and then also perennial woody plants. The inflorescence is unique in the Asteraceae. So they have an inflorescence that's called a head, and it has many flowers. And if you take a look at this picture down here, I want to point out that it's made up of 2 different kinds of tiny little flowers. So you may refer to this thing as a flower. It's actually an inflorescence made up of many flowers. So this right here, what I'm circling, is a flower. This right here that I'm circling is a flower. There's also some flowers within this head that have bilateral symmetry. So this is a large petal from a little flower. Here you can see, I'm not sure, those might be the stamens sticking out, that has bilateral symmetry. So these heads are often made up of flowers that have bilateral symmetry called ray flowers, and some flowers that have radial symmetry called disc flowers. So they're all arranged together in one head. One thing that I forgot to point out is that when you're trying to identify members of this genus, you're often going to be asked to break the stem and look at the sap. So there's a large group within this family that has milky sap. So you've probably experienced that before in dandelions. And then there are many other plants within this family that have watery sap. So sometimes that's something that you need to do when you're identifying plants within the sunflower family or the Asteraceae, is to tear off a leaf, break open the stem, and see what the sap looks like. These little individual flowers that make up the heads don't have any sepals. Their fruit is an achene, often with hairs on top. So think about the little fruit of the dandelion. So it's a little achene, like this one right here, with hairs on top that catch the wind and are dispersed by the wind. Okay, now let's look at the mustard family, or the Brassicaceae family. This is another family. It's not quite as large, but I'm emphasizing this one because it has some really strong unifying characteristics that you can generally see in the field. So it's a good family to know if you're getting into identifying plants in the field. So there are about 3,500 species within the mustard family globally. They're mostly herbaceous plants. Their sap is pungent, so think about arugula and other mustard greens. They have that sort of spicy taste often, and that kind of pungent smell. The leaf edge is often dentate or lobed, so think about the arugula leaf with those lobes, and they often have hairs, and you can clearly see hairs running along the leaf and the stem of this plant, which is in the genus Arabis. The flowers in the mustard family are very distinct. They have radial symmetry, like you can see here on this spring whitlow grass flower. This has 4 petals, but the petals are sort of forked, so it almost looks like it has 8. But they really are just 4 little petals. You can see in this Arabis we've got 4 petals as well. So they have radial symmetry with 4 petals that are not fused. And people talk about how it looks like these petals are in a cross. So these 2 are running straight up and down, whereas these 2 are running side to side. Members of the mustard family generally have 6 stamens, and the fruit is a silique, which we see here. So remember that those are those pods that are made up of from 2 carpels, and they have that central papery partition upon which the seeds are attached. Some of the members of the mustard family make shorter fruits, which are similar in structure. They're just different in size, and those are called silicles. Another family that has a lot of great field characteristics that members can easily be identified to family in the field is the bean family, or Fabaceae. This family has about 13,000 species globally. They're mostly herbaceous plants, although there are some trees like the black locust tree and some shrubs. The leaves are generally alternate. They are often compound, like we see here in this plant, and like we see in lupin, for example. And they sometimes have tendrils. So tendrils are these little modified leaves that can grab on to other structures and support the plant. Members of this family often have stipules, and stipules are leaf-like structures, although they aren't leaves, that come off the stem just as the leaf is coming off. So these would be stipules down here. The flowers generally have bilateral symmetry. So we can see that if we look at this flower, there's only one plane of symmetry here. And there's some specific terminology that we use to describe the flowers that are generated by species within Fabaceae. So they generally have 5 petals. The one in the back is called the banner petal. And then there's 2 wings that are sort of protruding out, and then kind of tucked underneath between those wings is a 5th petal, the keel petal. So the banner petal, this is actually 2 petals up here, and then each wing is an additional petal, and so is the keel. They often have many stamens, so 10 or even more. The fruit, as you know, is a legume. It's also notable that members of the Fabaceae family are capable of generating little nodules in their roots that house nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So they can play a really important role in ecosystems by fixing nitrogen, making it available within the soil. Another family of flowering plants that we'll see a lot of on our field trip is the Ranunculaceae family, or the buttercup family. So there are about 2,000 species globally, and that includes mostly annual or perennial herbs, although there are some woody plants in the Ranunculaceae family. They generally have palmately compound or palmately lobed leaves. So you can sort of see that when you look at these leaves. This one looks like it's palmately compound. This one looks like it's palmately lobed. The flowers they can be solitary, or they can be part of an inflorescence or a raceme or a spike. The flowers are generally bisexual, meaning they have both carpels and stamens. The symmetry is often radial, as you can see in all of these columbines and in this buttercup. And the floral parts are generally free. So the petals are not fused to petals, and the petals are not fused to sepals, so they're generally free. The stamens are often numerous, and they're usually spirally inserted. So we talked about spiral insertion when we were looking at that magnolia flower. That means, in this case, that the stamens are not just along one single plane in the flower, but they're sort of creeping up the receptacle. There can be 3 to many carpels on the members of the Ranunculaceae family flowers, and the fruit is diverse. It can be a follicle or an achene or a berry, or rarely a capsule. Now let's take a look at the rose family, Rosaceae. There are about 3,000 species within this family globally, It includes members that are herbaceous, like strawberries, or woody, like crowleaf mountain mahogany. The leaves are variable. They can be compound, like we see here in the rose. But in the mountain mahogany, we know that those are simple leaves. They often have stipules. You can sort of see these stipules here on the leaf base in the rose plant. The flowers have radial symmetry and 5 petals arising from a fairly unique structure called a hypanthium. And in this section of the flower, you can see the hypanthium. It's this cup-like structure that's formed from the fusion of sepals and petals and anthers, and it forms a little cup that the carpel resides in. The stamens are usually numerous, as you can clearly see here for this rose. And the fruit type is variable, including palms, like we see in apple and pear trees, drupes, like we see in nectarines and plums, drupelets, and drupelets are what we call a drupe when it's part of a aggregate. So the blackberries and raspberries are also part of this family, so those fruits would be drupelets, part of a aggregate of drupes. And in some cases, they're producing dry capsules or nutlets, so it's pretty varied. This family, as you probably already know, has many economically valuable plants, including many fruit trees and many nut trees. So there's a lot of edible fruits within the rose family. The last family of eudicots that I want to look at is the saxifrage family, Saxifragaceae. And this includes about 600 species globally. So there aren't quite as many species in this family, but I decided to include it because we'll encounter a lot of members of this family on our field trips. So I wanted you to be familiar with some of these characteristics. Saxifragaceae includes mostly perennial herbs. The flowers generally have radial symmetry, as you can see here on the umbrella plant and then the California saxifrage below. The members of this family often generate white flowers, and they generally have 5 sepals and 5 petals that are not fused. One thing that's quite unique and a great characteristic for identifying members of this family is the carpels. So hopefully you can see here in this umbrella plant, there are 2, it almost looks like a little duck beak. There are 2 semi-fused carpels in there. So that's a great characteristic for identifying members of the saxifrage family. So they generally have 2 carpels which can be free or barely fused with this sort of forked or horn-like appearance. I think they kind of look like a duckbill. The fruit can be a capsule or 2 follicles. So these are some of the sources that I referred to in generating this presentation. Again, the goals are that you understand the differences between these large groups of angiosperms. So the basal angiosperms, how do they differ from the monocots and the eudicots, and what's the difference between the monocots and the eudicots? And I also want you to be familiar with the monocot and eudicot families that I presented here. Specifically, I want you to know some of their common characteristics within each of the families, and I want you to be able to see a plant in the field and to be able to associate it with one of those families, if it is indeed a species from one of those families. Thanks for listening.